Good afternoon, my name is FELIPE Pinto D'AGUIAR. I'm a composer and I'm very happy to be part of the symposium. So thank you very much to Agustin and all the people who has worked in the organization. Unfortunately, I couldn't travel this time, but I hope to do so in the future. My presentation is titled 2 Strategies for Utilizing Microtones in Orchestral Settings, and I will be discussing some practical considerations that I have observed while working with microtones in the context of large ensembles and orchestras. First, I will give some general context and then I will examine 2 cases of my own compositions. The first is a piece called Transparencias, which employs a traditional orchestral setup. 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, 2 French horns, 2 trumpets, timpani and strings. The second piece is called Ambientes and is written for a larger orchestra of 3 flutes, 3 oboes, 3 clarinets, 3 bassoons, 4 French horns, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, 1 tuba, 2 percussionists, harp and strings. The way I usually approach to microtones is by approximating and/or distorting overtones taken from the harmonic series. I often focus on the 7th, 11th and 13th partials, using quadratone approximations. These are relatively accurate for the 11th, which is minus 49 cents, and the 13th partial, which is plus 41 cents. But less so for the 7th partial, which is minus 31 cents. I also use the 9th partial approximated to equal temperament. However, I always rely in the ability of musicians to make fine-tuning contextually, as it happens in orchestral repertoire. That is why, in a large ensemble context, I do not utilize finer microtone indications in the score, but I will come back to this later. So the general approach is to reach certain intervals rather than working with equal divisions of the octave. In solo or chamber music, I would use more indications because it is easier to have more resolution, if you want, and also to have more control. You can see in the following example that I add a number over the accidental to show which partial the musician should tune to. But this is a chamber music context, so I think such a request of a spectral math is something you can ask for. Now, let's move to the orchestral context. The first case I would like to present is a piece for classical orchestra or medium-sized orchestra. Here, the woodwinds are treated as soloists, so there are microtones written for them, which should be acquired ideally by utilizing special fingerings rather than making embouchure adjustments, although that's more my own preference than a norm. You can see an example of the score in this slide. Regarding the strings, there are microtones in the sections, and for this to work you really have to have at least 3 or more instruments playing simultaneously. The slight variations in the tuning may produce a chorus effect, which is something I like. Additionally, for more precise pitches, natural harmonics in specific strings can also be used. The second case is a composition for full orchestra. Here the approach is different because a portion of the orchestra tunes a quarter tone lower. I found a reference for this approach in the piece Reflections, Reflet, number 2, High Voltage, Haute Tension by Tristan Murail. By adjusting the mouthpiece of the third of flutes, oboes, clarinets, and making tube adjustments in a French horn and trumpet, some musicians tune a quarter tone lower than the rest of the orchestra. This allows for an extension of the pitches palette without utilizing special fingerings or embouchure adjustments, which I found useful for a more complex and expensive rehearsal regime as the one of a full orchestra is. It is important to keep in mind that the mouthpiece adjustment changes the pitch in a manner that is not consistent throughout the register of the instrument, so the extremes are slightly distorted. That is not a problem perceptually for the upper register, but it can generate issues in the lower part of the range. Here there is an example showing flute, oboe and clarinet, the three playing approximately -50 cents, which enriches the harmony by adding color and allowing the overall texture to fuse better. Regarding the strings, the approach is also different compared to the first composition. Here, the microtones are used exclusively by soloists. The tutti section always play with no microtones, so different dynamics are used to compensate the asymmetry in the number of string instruments. But a fundamental question I haven't introduced yet is why to use microtones? Perhaps the answer is obvious for us here in the symposium, although I think it is a relevant question in general. As I already mentioned, there are some important aspects that require the use of microtones. The first is color. The pitch palette enriches substantially by including more frequencies. The second reason is the fact that when fine-tuning harmony, harmony becomes timbre. That is to say that we stop listening to chords or collections of pitches and start listening to timbral objects, which is something I look for. Another interesting feature of using microtones in ensemble or orchestral contexts is the emergence of beatings due to close frequencies interacting with each other, and the possibility of having then super dense clusters. Now I would like to show you a few short sound excerpts to illustrate some of the things I have said, and later a longer excerpt of the full orchestral work. We will switch now to Ambientes. Now we will listen to a longer excerpt of Ambientes performed by the Cape Town Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Kelvin Groten. To finish, before we have some time for discussion, I would like to sketch a few preliminary conclusions. First is that ensemble or orchestral musicians do fine-tuning adjustments in their regular practice, even with historical repertoire, sometimes especially with historical repertoire. So I found no need to be over-specific with notation if the context is somewhat self-evident and the instrumental forces are large. We find examples of this phenomenon in the late Romantic era, with the expansion of harmonic language and the use of large orchestras, Musicians often adjust their intonation to match the shifting harmonic centers. For instance, brass sections in Wagnerian operas or Mahler symphonies adjust their tuning to ensure that important chords, like the tonic or the dominant, sound as rich, resonant, and powerful as possible. Since I'm using rather restrained collections of chords, musicians rapidly know when they are playing, for instance, a 7th or an 11th partial, and they can adjust quickly to the context. Second, quadrtone approximation notation is often enough. Third, differentiated tunings can work effectively in large ensembles, although I'm not so sure they work for string sections. There is the example of the piece Ramifications by György Ligeti, which I love in recordings, by the way, but I'm yet to experience an effective live performance. Finally, to conclude, I believe that all music is microtonal, no matter the use or not of a specific microtonal accidentals. There are always contextual adjustments even in traditional tonal repertoire. And this practice, which orchestral musicians have, can be exploited by microtonal composers and performers. Thank you very much.